This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Tucker Ferda. Dr. Ferda is Associate Professor of New Testament at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He is the author of the brand new book, Jesus and His Promised Second Coming, Jewish Eschatology and Christian Origins, out now on Eerdmans Press. In this book, Ferda challenges a long-standing assumption in New Testament scholarship by arguing that the hope for Jesus' second coming was not a product of the early church, but originated with the historical Jesus himself. We will be discussing this excellent book on the show today. Dr. Ferda, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about this. We were talking before the show. I really enjoyed reading this book. But before we get into the work today, tell us about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned I teach at Pittsburgh Seminary. So I'm part of a great team of faculty here that I'm kind of responsible for the New Testament portion of our curriculum, and specifically our Gospels and Life of Jesus and reception history material. So a lot of the stuff that I'm doing in this book is really of interest to me, not only in my scholarship and research, but in my teaching. And I really feel blessed to be here, and I'm really excited about being part of Pittsburgh Seminary because I don't feel like it's really a job in many ways. I mean, I'm doing things that I really, really love to do. I was raised in a context where Scripture was really important. The Bible was really important. I was really interested in that as growing up. And I also had a real interest in history. And so when I went to college at Bethel University, my initial plan was to be a history teacher, a high school history teacher. And then I had I took a Bible class at Bethel and realized that, hey, this interest I have in Scripture and the interest I have in history can actually be conjoined. There are people that do this kind of thing for a living. And I really caught the bug and really haven't stopped since then. So yeah, at the seminary here, I teach courses on biblical Greeks. Like right now, I'm teaching a Greek class, a year-long sequence in Greek, and then courses on the Gospels and the life of Jesus.
Well, your book is definitely a reflection of that historical interest. It is a very wide-ranging book, and you cover a lot of ground. And we're going to talk about all of that on the show today. But what motivated you to write Jesus and His Promised Second Coming? Because it had to have been a lot of work. It is jam-packed with content.
Yeah, it was a big endeavor, and it took me, I think I say somewhere in there that it took about 7 years to finish the thing, partly because, I was doing some of the research and writing during the pandemic and didn't have full access to a library and stuff that slowed the project down a little bit. But I never, it was a lot of work, but I never got bored. And actually, now that it's done, in some ways, I kind of miss it because it was just so engaging all the time. I was just learning so much and enjoyed the research so much. But in terms of my motivation, I mentioned this in the book, but there was a moment when I was a doctoral student. I was like a lot of people do in this kind of thing. You're a TA or a preceptor for a course, and it was a big class on the origins of Christianity. And I remember an exchange the professor had with a student in the front row of the class. The topic of the day was the eschatological teaching of Jesus, and the professor was trying to put forward this view from Albert Schweitzer and others that Jesus expected the kingdom to come in his own lifetime. And the student raised her hand and said, well, what about all the stuff in the Gospels about the second coming? Which is a very fair question. And the professor said, all the scholars are in agreement that all that stuff comes from the early church after Easter and has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. And at the time when it kind of stuck with me for a moment, even at the time, because I realized that here I was really interested in historical Jesus. I was reading a lot about it, and I was not aware of a single major treatment that really took up this question seriously. And that seemed really weird because it's a fair question. And so that was kind of the initial thing of I kind of want to dig into this. I wouldn't have disagreed with the professor's response at that time. But why is that? What is the actual historical argument for that? And so that was an initial thing. And then in my dissertation research a few years later, I was reading a lot of 19th century biographies of Jesus. So a lot of things that people don't really read anymore in historical Jesus scholarship. And I was surprised to find in a lot of this material that there were historians in this time that argued the second coming hope did go back to Jesus. And they fit it into his ministry with this theory of a Galilean crisis. So it was this idea that Jesus was rejected at some point and kind of changed his mind and moved to a plan B after rejection. And it's a very speculative hypothesis, but I just found it intriguing and interestingly not really talked about in current Jesus research. So the fact that I didn't know of anything contemporary and there was this older like reception historical antecedent for this thing, I really wanted to dive into it more. And it was an exciting project to begin because I wasn't really starting out with a thesis to defend. I just knew that there weren't a lot of people writing about it. Whatever I concluded would be a contribution just because it's something no one's taken up in recent years. And so I could just write and follow the evidence wherever it led, And as I got more into it, I found that I was actually going to make an argument that challenged a kind of consensus view in the field, at least an unstated consensus. But that wasn't my original plan. It's just kind of where I found the evidence leading over time.
And it is surprising to me because I do read a lot of books on biblical scholarship that this is not an issue that's been broached by a lot of historical Jesus researchers at all. And in fact, in the earlier chapters of the book, you talk, and I'm sure we'll get into it in a minute, but you talk about how like some of the last great like monographs on this subject were written 50 years ago. So it's just not been at the center of attention. I think for my audience to kind of situate your project within the larger field of historical Jesus research, there's not one united field. There are a lot of different paths that people take in historical Jesus research and a lot of different schools of thought. And you claim that your scholarship is a part of the eschatological Jesus tradition in particular. So would you explain that to my audience? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's helpful to organize Jesus research on this question into really three different streams of tradition or three different camps. And the first one, which is the field in which I would, place myself, is this tradition that goes back probably most notably to Albert Schweitzer with his famous 1906 book. It's translated into English as The Quest of the Historical Jesus. This is where we get this quest language. It comes from the translation of his work. But Schweitzer's argument was that, Jesus during his lifetime expected the kingdom to come in a dramatic and transformative way. He actually thinks Jesus believed this was going to happen two different times, once kind of during the ministry, and then he was disappointed when it didn't happen, when he was actually on the cross, trying to force God's hand. But it's a stream of interpretation that, it takes the Gospels, a lot of the eschatological language in the Gospels, and interprets that language in a more literal fashion. So when Jesus is talking about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, Schweitzer thought like he's really talking about like a kind of celestial being coming from heaven, or a lot of the other language. He reads this in a very literal kind of way. A lot of people didn't agree necessarily with Schweitzer's huge reconstruction, but that approach was really influential and has been developed by subsequent scholars like E.P. Sanders and Paula Fredrickson and Dale Allison, who are scholars I engage with throughout. And I'll come back to that in a second. But so that's kind of one stream of interpretation. The other one, which you could really understand probably as the foil for that view, is that Jesus really didn't have any significant eschatological teaching whatsoever. So in more recent years, the famous Jesus seminar is a great example of this. So on a really interesting level, in some ways, there's an underlying interpretive agreement between like the seminar and Schweitzer and other folks, and that people are interpreting this material in the Gospels in a more literal way, saying the Son of Man really does refer to someone coming from the clouds or something. There's a disagreement, though, in terms of what's historical. And so the Jesus seminar is saying, yeah, that's the best way to read that stuff, but it has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. All that stuff comes from the early church. And then in the middle, I would say, is a kind of symbolically eschatological Jesus, which you might link to, say, famous and influential scholars like N.T. Wright or George Caird, who are basically taking all of the material in the Gospels and linking it to Jesus, to the historical Jesus, but saying that it's been misinterpreted if we're understanding that language in a literal fashion. So when Jesus is talking about the Son of Man, he's speaking, in an apocalyptic metaphor or symbolically as a kind of social political commentary on, things going on in the first century. So I am firmly kind of in the Schweitzer stream, and both in terms of the underlying interpretation of a lot of this material. I think it does indeed, it's intended in a more literal fashion in the Gospels. And then also on the historical level, kind of against the Jesus seminar, that I think it's hard to divorce a lot of this stuff from the historical Jesus. The issue I have, and why I think the book is important, is within that Schweitzer stream of tradition, is that subsequent scholars who have tried to kind of champion his cause have interestingly not taken up the question of the second coming in any kind of serious way. And so you'll find, scholars like E.P. Sanders, for instance, or others who think that Jesus talked about the coming of the kingdom in an imminent frame, but not necessarily his own return. And he didn't see himself in that scenario in any kind of notable way. But that really wasn't an argument that was made like robustly. It wasn't argued. It was just kind of assumed. And so what I see myself doing here is looking for kind of nuance and clarity within that Schweitzerian stream of tradition. Because I firmly believe that in like the debate with the Jesus seminar, and I would say in the debate with like N.T. Wright and others that are kind of in that camp, the eschatological interpretation makes better sense contextually of the Gospels. I just think there's some open questions that have not been resolved.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, you spend several chapters at the beginning of your book looking over the history of interpretation of Jesus' second coming. And I think that it's pretty obvious for a lot of people that the Enlightenment completely changed the way that people in the Western world thought about faith and thought about these issues as well. And so in a lot of ways, modern biblical scholarship is a product of questions that were generated during the Enlightenment. So you have a chapter looking at the way that Jesus' second coming was understood before the Enlightenment, and then a chapter exploring how Jesus' second coming was understood after the Enlightenment. I want to start with the pre-Enlightenment period before. How do people generally understand the idea of Jesus' second coming in the New Testament before the Enlightenment?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of these things I found so fascinating in my research, and not being a trained church historian, I was again really curious about, I didn't know necessarily what I was going to find as I started digging around. And this took a lot of work. A lot of my time working on this book was working on this part two. But in general, I mean, there's obviously, you could say the history of Christianity is a history of contestation and debates about really significant things. But it's striking that there was, for a large portion of Christian history, at least, there was far less debate and contestation about, the line from the Nicene Creed, "He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead," right? There was a lot of debate about kind of what the nature of this return would be, or how like spiritual or literal it would be. And there was debate about when it would happen, how soon it was, or how far away it was. But there was a general agreement about the kind of realism of this hope, like a general realism that like when it happened, you wouldn't really be able to deny that it happened. Like it wasn't just a symbolic way of speaking about something, but it was looking for a real change, either the end of history or a significant change within history. And that really persists, as far as I could tell. That really persists up through the Reformation. I mean, there's many different branches of the Christian tree I could have traced. I'm looking after a while kind of towards the Western stream of tradition, because I'm looking at New Testament scholarship and Jesus research as it grew out of that. But for me, that was a really interesting thing to find, just how the kind of widespread agreement on that. And then even some notable theologians who had some pretty nuanced views of eschatology. Their nuance didn't really extend to challenging the idea that this was in the future for Christians. So a couple famous examples, like Origen of Alexandria, is famous for his spiritual interpretation of Scripture. And in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, when he's reading this Olivet discourse from Jesus in Matthew 24, that has a lot of stuff about the coming of the Son of Man and so on, he starts out by saying, he's not trying to dispense with what he calls the simpler understanding in the church, that this really refers to the second coming of Jesus. He wants to instead supplement that with what he calls solid food and not milk. So drawing on some language from Paul's letters. So he's kind of going deeper, but he's not claiming that his spiritual reading is in place of the more literal kind of basic reading of it. He's just trying to push deeper in a spiritual way. So I found that really intriguing, that even with Origen's really speculative kind of system, he still somehow in his own world, he had a way of fitting that together with this more widespread view. And then the other really significant figure is Augustine. And Augustine in the City of God, at the end of the City of God, he explicitly affirms the creed and uses the language of the creed about the return of Christ to judge the living and the dead. but he did take issue with millenarian readings of Revelation and certain views of eschatology that expected Jesus to maybe set up like a real political kingdom on earth or something. He challenged that, but he saw himself as still defending, we might say, a realistic view of the return of Jesus. And he was also skeptical of people trying to predict when that was going to happen. So he didn't want people kind of messing around. He thought Jesus was intentionally vague about when this was going to happen.
Well, all of this changes with the Enlightenment, and I think that you do such a great job. And obviously, coming out of the tradition of Albert Schweitzer, who very famously deconstructed 19th century historical Jesus research, and said that more or less that all of these scholars who are reconstructing Jesus were building their reconstruction on modern ideas. You make the same point that after the Enlightenment, the conversation around the second coming of Jesus has essentially been predicated upon completely modernist ideas, and that everyone has just simply assumed that Jesus could not have predicted his second coming. So talk to us about that dynamic in scholarship. How did the Enlightenment change the trajectory of understanding of Jesus' second coming?
Yeah, for sure. So there's one thing that has been investigated a little bit already in Jesus research, and I think it's relevant for this. But it's the idea you get in Enlightenment Christianity that an interest in what is the rational or the justifiable in Christianity and what is not, like what is essential to it that it can be defended intellectually and what is not. And like all of us probably do, we tend to associate the things that we find rational and compelling about a certain system, with a figure we really look up to. So what happened for a lot of these early Enlightenment thinkers is they didn't really challenge Jesus so much. They rather saw that the true historical figure of Jesus really agreed with what they thought about the true nature of religion. And all this stuff, all the kind of negative, superstitious, supernatural stuff that Christianity should shed in the modern world, they associated with the disciples, with his early followers who, after his ministry, they see kind of going back to their older ways and not living up to the higher ethical, rational ideas of the historical Jesus. So that is indeed a kind of new thing that happens in the Enlightenment period that I think is, and I try to frame this in the book too, that this, interestingly, some of these thinkers doing this is well before, Hermann Samuel Romaris, who wrote in the late 18th century and is often credited as being the first real historical Jesus scholar. I mean, I found stuff all through the 1600s and early 1700s where the people are already doing this kind of work. Maybe not as thoroughly as Romaris was, but Romaris was himself indebted to these earlier deistic thinkers and Enlightenment thinkers, and is far less original, actually, than people often think that he is. So that is certainly a new thing. The other thing, though, that I would say is not so new, even if it's more directed in a more pointed way against Christian tradition, is this unfortunate thing of Christian caricatures of Judaism. And this really made a significant impact on the reception history of the Second Coming. So we have, a sad history of, for a long time, of people, often Christian theologians, distinguishing Jesus from Judaism and showing how Jesus is not only different than kind of the central tenets of Judaism, but often superior to. So Judaism is kind of created as a foil against which Jesus can stand out as, all the better. And one really important way this happened throughout the Middle Ages and even earlier was in this polemical exegetical literature about the true meaning of the Old Testament. You find solidifying this caricature of what Jews think about the Messiah. So there's this common stereotype that Jews expect, this kind of carnal, terrestrial, military leader. And the idea is that Jesus is diametrically opposed to this idea, and a large part of his ministry is trying to correct this false understanding of messianism. Now, nowhere as far as I can find in like the Middle Ages and up through the Reformation do you find people turning that Jewish messianism against the second coming hope. But what happens for these Enlightenment era historians is they take this caricature of Jewish messianism and they say, that actually sounds a lot like the idea of the second coming. And there's this long tradition of trying to distance Jesus from Jewish messianism. So it was a very easy step for them to make, to say, well, we know Jesus was critiquing Jewish messianism Therefore, he could not have had anything to do with the second coming idea. It must stem from his Jewish followers who kind of went back on his teaching after he left the scene. And so that's a really significant move that I think broadens the conversation partners in historical Jesus scholarship. It shows that the 19th century historians were indebted to medieval kind of exegetical literature in ways that has been overlooked, and challenges some of the periodizations. We're not just, things didn't just start with Romaris. They are building on a much deeper history.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. I actually just finished reading not long ago. I'm going to be interviewing Craig Blomberg next week, and he has a new book out called Jesus the Purifier, where he tries to integrate John's gospel. But what he has a review of the three quests for the historical Jesus, and that's essentially what he says the entire time is like, these are all just kind of made up categories. They kind of generally help us out, but there's nothing objective to them. But I do think that the big point that you make in your book that's really, really important for readers to understand is that the assumption has just been for the last 200 years or so that Jesus could not have taught his own second coming, that was just something that simply the historical Jesus could not have done. And you're going to push back on that in your book. Methodologically speaking, you have a very interesting way of approaching this. And you kind of talk about this in more detail in your book, and I want you to explain this. But I think the common thought would be for people to begin with the historical Jesus himself and then kind of work forward from that, maybe going to the letters of Paul and then going to the early church and beyond to kind of see how that idea of the second coming developed. But you actually do that in reverse. You look at the teachings of the early church and kind of work your way back through the Gospels to the historical Jesus himself. So talk a little bit about your methodology. Why did you choose that method instead of the one that might seem natural to many New Testament scholars?
Yeah, for sure. So this is, if I could just say that this is kind of related to what I'm teaching right now. I'm teaching a Gospels intro class at the seminary here. And as I'm thinking about how am I going to introduce material, in what order am I going to introduce things, and students sometimes have questions about this. We intentionally do not start with the historical Jesus. We start with the Gospels. And then it's not really until November that we even have a couple of sessions where we talk about the historical Jesus. And the logic undergirding that is, time might move forward in the sense that we have Jesus, Paul, the writing of the Gospels, and so on. But historians have to work backwards. And for us, a really fundamental kind of premise for me methodologically is that the historical Jesus must always remain a question that we don't know necessarily the answer to. It's always something that is inferred about the past on the basis of the very fragmentary evidence that we have. So historians are always working backward. We have no access to Jesus apart from the historical Jesus, apart from the really fragmentary sources that have been preserved. So my issue with, say, Glasson and Robinson, who were these two, probably the last two significant figures to write monographs on this topic, and both of them conclude on slightly different grounds that this hope does not have anything to do with the historical Jesus. They work forward in time, meaning they start with the historical Jesus, and within the first couple chapters, they've already kind of reconstructed the essence of who they think Jesus was and what his teaching was. And then they use that Jesus to critique other elements of the tradition, whether it be the Gospels or Paul's letters, as they come upon those things. And my problem with that is that it gets things entirely backwards. We don't know anything about the historical Jesus apart from what we can infer about the past from Paul's letters and from the Gospels. So it also reflects the fact that I am actually much more skeptical as a historian than Glasson and Robinson are. So they think that we can kind of break the Gospels up into these little pieces that some parts are authentic, some parts historical, and other stuff is like theological overlay. And my own opinion is like it's much messier than that. And we can't neatly divide memory and invention or memory and later theology. All we can do is look at these sources and try to make probabilistic inferences about how they could have come to exist. I do very little in this book arguing that Jesus actually said this or that thing. I argue instead, like, as historians, we need to infer that whoever the figure is behind all these sources, they must not be so discontinuous with the sources as has been commonly assumed in Jesus research.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess this would be a good time. I wanted to ask you this later on, but I think this is the perfect place for that now. Maybe just explain real quick. I think you've done a good job of setting this up, but there are a lot of people that are new to New Testament scholarship that just have a really hard time grasping that the material in the Gospels might not actually historically go back to the events that are being portrayed themselves. So maybe just talk, because you do address this in your book a little bit, maybe just address that dynamic real quick. Like what kind of information does the Gospels give us, and how are the Gospels different from, say, like a video recording of what Jesus actually would have done and
Yeah.
said?
Yeah, for sure. That's really a great way to phrase that question. I mean, I think that the first really crucial thing is just to see that the Gospels were, and some people dispute this, but in my view, the Gospels were not written, during the lifetime of Jesus, or people weren't really taking notes during the time of Jesus, and so the sources that we have are several decades removed from the time of Jesus himself. They're actually still pretty close to the time Jesus ministered compared to many other sources we have for other historical figures. That's really important. But there's still like 3-4 decades, where I think the entirety of Paul's ministry has begun and concluded before the Gospels are ever written down. So there are a lot of things have happened in the first century, and the gospel material, as it later has become written down, wasn't like it was all invented later. But it was being used in these churches, and being passed on in churches and it had theological significance, it had ethical significance for how people were living, and so the gospel material betrays that use. It was shaped in that use, and I do think early Christians in this period were interested in history, but their interest in this material went beyond just kind of, did Jesus do that? That's kind of a modern preoccupation only with, like, is it historical or not? I think it was assumed generally that it was. I think there was historical interest, but people are trying to live their lives according to this teaching, and so there is, as would happen with traditions in this way, authoritative traditions, as it enters new contexts, it is changed, it is exaggerated, it is developed, and this doesn't mean in any kind of pernicious way, but people, as the Jesus tradition enters new contexts, those people might have questions about ethical things or things they're dealing with that the tradition doesn't necessarily address, but they give it the benefit of the doubt and they look at it deeper and they find truths that might kind of develop what was actually there, but they think they're doing it in a kind of faithful way, right? So that's a natural way that tradition can grow and expand. And so the Gospels, when they're finally written down, they are mixtures of memory about things that happened, but also theology and later development as people are trying to live according to this tradition. And it's really hard to divide those things up. It's really hard to separate that after the fact. And I'd also just say, too, that there is a kind of genre. So you mentioned the kind of closed circuit camera model. I think sometimes when we think about, modern historians are not always the best models to understand ancient historians. There were different expectations and norms around the kind of flexibility and freedom and creativity that could go into, say, writing speeches of famous people. It was kind of known that historians would develop a little bit and even kind of rhetorically show off in some cases in these spaces. That was perfectly acceptable. So it's a matter of there's kind of baked into the genre of ancient history writing, ancient biography writing, a little more room for flexibility and expansion than we might think about if we were only thinking in modern terms.
No, that was a perfect explanation of that. And so this is going to help us understand why we're going to start with Paul, look at the Gospels, and then go back behind the Gospels to the historical Jesus himself. Your chapter on Paul was excellent. And the theme of the second coming, I obviously I knew that it was there, but I didn't realize just how ingrained into the Pauline world that it was. And you make the claim in the book that the idea of Jesus' second coming is pretty much ubiquitous in the early church. So just walk us through this. How do we see the idea of Jesus' second coming working out in Paul and then in other places in early Christianity?
Yeah, for sure. So Paul, I'm not writing a Pauline theology, or I'm not trying to distill. There's really great works that are doing that. My interest in Paul is really obviously what Paul is saying, but I'm really curious about what Paul tells us about the rest of the Jesus movement, what we can infer about the nature of Jesus tradition and eschatology based upon what Paul is doing. So and what I find really intriguing about this is, as you well know, Paul he's engaged in all kinds of conflict and controversy about some really significant things in these early movements, right? Especially pertaining to like Gentile inclusion and circumcision. These are a lot of the food fights Paul is dealing with, where there is within the Jesus group itself, there's some serious disagreement about this. And so he has to write letters, defending, advancing, arguing for his own position. What I find so intriguing is that nowhere is Paul doing that when it comes to the general idea of the return of Jesus. And so the idea is, people would dispute maybe little bits of this, but I think that Paul, in almost every letter that has been preserved from Paul, there's at least some passing reference to the return of Jesus. And in many cases, they are just short phrases, about like the day of Jesus, or, that show that Paul is not only not really worried about somebody coming back with him and being like, well, you need to defend yourself and make an argument for that, but he's assuming his audience kind of already knows what he's talking about when it comes to this, and there's a general baseline agreement about that. So that for me is really significant in understanding, like you had said, the kind of widespread common view in these different churches that Jesus was going to come back again at some point, So that's really important. I think to dive maybe into one letter just to see kind of how this works out really, really briefly, I think what we see in 1 Thessalonians is really significant to kind of flesh out some of the stuff I was saying, because this is probably Paul's first letter. And we're we're only a couple decades away here from the activity of Jesus. And we're thrown into this exchange kind of midway. So there's been stuff that's happened before as Paul and other people have been to this area. Paul is writing a letter responding to a crisis of sorts in this church. And based upon things he says in 1 Thessalonians, we can tell that whatever Paul had said to them in his initial proclamation of the gospel and the initial founding of this church, that the return of Jesus was really significant in that initial proclamation. Even says at the beginning of 1 Thessalonians that you turned to the living God from idols to wait for his Son from heaven, who saves us from the wrath that is coming. So that wouldn't have been news to the Thessalonians. That would have been kind of a rehash of what they already believed and knew, right? So we get a sense of early Pauline teaching, right, about that. And then there's a lot of things going on in 1 Thessalonians, but part of the reason Paul needed to write this letter was that people had questions about, what do we do with some people that have died before Jesus has come back? And there was some concern about that. So I don't think there's evidence enough to say that Paul had predicted Jesus would return before anyone died. I think that's an overreading of this, but it is still very striking that a community of Christians would feel the need to write to Paul with a question about how the return of Christ connects with, makes sense of, can be related to the experience of people dying. And so that says something about the imminence of Paul's expectation, the idea that he's teaching about the second coming, but he's also talking about it happening very soon. And that he maybe in his proclamation didn't feel the need to piece together carefully how this expectation fits with the resurrection of the dead and other things. So what I see Paul doing in 1 Thessalonians 4 is he's trying to draw together some threads from things they probably likewise already expected, the return of Jesus and the general resurrection of the dead. And he's saying, look, these things are going to coincide. And when Jesus comes back, the dead are going to be raised first. So don't worry. Don't think they're going to like miss out on this, right? But it just says something about the imminence of his expectation and the significance of it for the founding of this group. The other thing that I find really significant in this letter is that Paul says that he's sharing this insight in 1 Thessalonians 4 with them by word of the Lord. Okay. There's been a lot of debate in New Testament scholarship about what this exactly means. And I do not intentionally move here immediately to, is this a saying of the historical Jesus? But I try to rather argue that regardless of whether it is or not, I think it's very likely that Paul thinks that it is. So I think part of the rhetorical force of what Paul is doing, and there's some other analogies we can find, ways Paul says things in other letters. I think Paul is trying to comfort this church by saying, look, we have it on the authority of Jesus himself and his own teaching that this is what's going to happen as he returns. That's really significant because that could be totally wrong, and Jesus didn't have anything to say with that. But that's really significant historically that we have a figure in our earliest evidence for the Christian movement, 1 Thessalonians, who's talking about the second coming in this way, and he seems to assume that the founding leader of this movement had talked about this. So that's where I see, and I don't see anything in Paul's letters that leads us to suspect a kind of move away from that or a significant change of opinion.
Yeah, this leads us naturally to the Gospels. Now, in your book, you have a chapter on Mark, you have a chapter on Matthew and Luke, and you have a chapter on John. But I kind of just want to talk about the Gospels generally for our purposes today. What do we get out of the Gospels about the second coming of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a significant thing methodologically. If I could just name this, is there are like lots of individual passages that have been at the center of food fights about this. One of the things I'm trying to do a little bit differently is instead of just going straight to those debated passages. So, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, there are three particular passages that all mention the coming of the Son of Man. And there's been a lot of debate about what exactly those refer to and if they go back to Jesus or not. What I'm trying to do instead is say, like, let's look at the entire Gospel of Mark and try to make sense before we wonder, like, are these things historical, whatever. Like, what the source that preserved these sayings or made them up or transmitted them to us, what does this source lead us to believe about the meaning of these sayings? So I'm trying to look at kind of what is the narrative arc of the Gospel of Mark? What is the vision for the future that it seems to hold forth in general? And how does the second coming idea or the return of Jesus or the appearance of Jesus fit in that larger thing? And so for Mark, for instance, I would say that there's lots of evidence throughout the Gospel of Mark that the readers of Mark are being situated in a kind of in-between time where they are living after Jesus, where they believe climactic things have happened. But Jesus says things in Mark that really cannot be understood, I think, if they're all like things that were fulfilled before or at the time of the readers of Mark. There are threads that are begun in Mark that look beyond the readership of Mark and are not tied off in the gospel, and they're not tied off in the immediate experience of the Markan readers. Okay, so that's important because if we think about the framing of the whole narrative, like eschatology is a significant component of how this source is framing time and thinking about the future and the experience of the reader. So if from that perspective, I argue that these three climactic passages, the end of Mark 8, end of the apocalyptic discourse in Mark 13, and the reply to Caiaphas in 14, make sense in this larger frame. And I get into some detailed exegesis on why I think when Jesus is talking about the coming of the Son of Man, he's really talking about the kind of a return after a brief period of absence. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke are building on Mark, and I don't see any reason to think that they totally remake that image into something new. So Matthew, if anything, only intensifies that by adding additional detail and adding parables about the return of Jesus to those precise parts where Mark is kind of talking about that stuff. Luke has more of a realized eschatology and puts more emphasis on what Jesus has already accomplished, but he does not ever totally expunge the idea of the return of Jesus. And in some places, he may also kind of bring it out more forcefully with some unique Lucan material that's not even mentioned in the other Gospels. And then finally, I do look at the Gospel of John briefly. And while I personally see John doing something a little bit different, and I see a really heightened realized eschatology in the Gospel of John, I argue that John still does hold out hope for things that are yet to happen in the future, including the resurrection of the dead, the judgment. And I think in chapter 14, when Jesus talks about, I will come again to you, that is probably best understood as a kind of vague allusion to this more widespread hope of the return of Jesus. So I see a slightly different eschatology in John, but nothing that is completely discontinuous with what we find in synoptic tradition. So all of the Gospels as a whole, at least, are kind of in the same symbolic world when it comes to eschatology.
Before we get to the historical Jesus himself, there are two concepts you identify in your book that are very important to the earliest Christians. And that is, of course, Daniel chapter 7, and then the idea of the day of the Lord. Talk to us about those two categories and how they relate to the historical Jesus before we look at the way that he might have conceptualized these things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Daniel 7, this dream vision that Daniel has about the beast coming out of the sea and the eventual destruction of the beasts and then the coming of one like a son of man and all these glory and kingship and stuff is given to him. Different parts of this vision and its aftermath are all over the Gospels. And so the New Testament scholars have wondered for a long time this weird phrase in Greek, hahuios tou anthropou, the son of man, the son of the man, literally, It's a kind of weird phrasing in Greek. A lot of the Son of Man sayings in the Gospels seem to look back to Daniel 7, where there's a mention of one like a Son of Man, to fill out what that means. And in some cases, that's unstated, but it's assumed that the reader is coming to the Gospels with knowledge of Daniel 7 and is interpreting these sayings of Jesus in full knowledge of that. So there's all kinds of Son of Man sayings, but there's lots of other stuff too. I mean, Jesus talks about giving the kingdom, which is a kind of interesting phrase. The giving language and with the kingdom as its direct object is something you find uniquely in Daniel 7. Jesus talks about his disciples sitting on thrones, judging or ruling, a lot of throne language, the request of James and John to sit on thrones. A lot of the subtext of that is probably Daniel 7. Even some of the parables, the mustard seed parable that grows into a great shrub or a great tree and the birds nest under its branches. This isn't probably Daniel 7, but an earlier kind of vision in Daniel. So just Daniel is kind of everywhere. And so what I'm doing as a historian is I'm looking at all of this stuff all over the tradition, and I'm stepping back and saying, like, where did all this come from? Right? I'm not trying to make the argument that Jesus said precisely this thing or that thing. I think it makes good sense, actually, that there would be some development, and maybe as people thought about Jesus in light of Daniel 7, that relationship would in turn create new sayings of Jesus. But I think it unlikely that this comes from nowhere, that this interest in Daniel 7 is something that developed completely independent from Jesus. The origin of this interest has to come from him in some kind of way. So that's what I think is going on with the Daniel 7 stuff.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we're getting to the part of the conversation where you really begin to push back against some of the prevailing ideas in historical Jesus research. And as we said before, it's just essentially been assumed that Jesus couldn't have predicted his own second coming. But you actually think that there's a real historical probability that Jesus would have not only foreseen his own second coming, but of course also his death as well, that he would have died and then there might have been some sort of interim period before he came again. So talk to us about how that works historically.
Yeah, it's a great question. So on my view, working as a historian here, I don't think that this argument requires in any way for us to assume that Jesus knew everything beforehand or that he was following a kind of script or blueprint. So I don't personally don't believe that, and I'm not trying to advance that argument. But I think on just purely historical grounds, there are a number of things that make this a reasonable inference. So Jesus, as far as we can tell from all of our sources, got his start after the ministry of John the Baptist. And we know that John the Baptist was executed. We don't know exactly when this happened, but Jesus was aware of this. And Jesus continued to minister after the death of John the Baptist and continued in many ways to link his ministry to that of John the Baptist. And so in my view, that is like, you can't do that and not be wondering like, well, this is what happened to this guy. You have to know that you're in danger. Right, Jesus even moves north into the Galilee, which is in the area, the kind of territory of Herod Antipas, who is responsible for killing John the Baptist. So this had to have been on his radar in some kind of way, just from that relationship. There are a number of things in the tradition that's a lot of name calling and some pretty lots of evidence that Jesus faced some really harsh opposition. Okay, so this was not all like Jesus was challenged in many ways, not just when he got to Jerusalem, but before that. And so it just would reinforce the sense of opposition and raising questions about the possible outcome of that. And then there's also, I think really importantly, there's this idea you find in many other Jewish texts, and I think there's evidence of it in the Jesus tradition as well, that before the kingdom of God comes, before the Messiah comes, however this is theorized in any given text, things are going to get worse before they get better. So it's sometimes called like the messianic tribulation or the messianic woes. And it's described in many different ways, sometimes with families being torn apart, right? Persecution and things. A lot of language that is in the Jesus tradition as he's kind of commenting on his own experience and talking about the future experience of his followers. So if Jesus is aware of the death of John the Baptist, he himself is actively facing opposition in his ministry, and he's operating with this eschatological assumption that things are going to get worse before they get better, right? It's not a big stretch to say that his death in Jerusalem or the possibility that he would be executed or die somehow, that could be a natural inference, it would, and it's very unlikely, I think, that what happened in Jerusalem would have caught Jesus completely by surprise.
The other complication to this picture is Jesus' resurrection. And if you look at a lot of the Jewish source materials, and I know you referenced 2 Maccabees 7, this is the one that came to mind to me immediately. The problem is that the problem is that I think that there are a lot of scholars that might even grant what you just said, that, okay, maybe Jesus could have conceptualized that he would die and that there would be an interim, but certainly his resurrection would happen at the general resurrection at the end of time, not before the general resurrection. So where does the early Christian belief about Jesus' resurrection in the middle of history, so to speak, fit into this analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question, so this is probably one place where I'm going to lose some readers in the sense of face more challenge perhaps on this particular front. So there have been, let me just say this first, there have been some other scholars who have argued in the past for tying the second coming hope to the historical Jesus. But they do so by arguing that Jesus not only expected that he would die, but also that he expected and taught that he would be raised after 3 days, and then he would return after that, right? And that is not my argument. So this is a one place where I think the tradition has actually gotten Jesus wrong in a way. In that I do not think that the historical Jesus predicted he would be raised again after 3 days. So I think Jesus talked about the resurrection and expected the resurrection fairly soon, and expected that, and probably expected that for himself and for others. But there is his own predictions of his own rate being raised after 3 days. This is not like the second coming hope, something that's kind of all over the place. It's actually localized in like a few really specific places. And they're pretty conspicuous in terms of how precisely they predict what exactly is going to happen to Jesus, these 3 famous passion resurrection predictions. So you can kind of pull them out of the tradition and leave a lot of everything else intact, like not really a lot is lost in doing that. And then there's also the fact, and this is an old argument, something that was recognized a long time ago, that the disciples don't seem to be expecting this after the death of Jesus, but rather seem to be completely caught off guard by the fact that the tomb was found empty and Jesus is raised. So that's, in my view, that's historically hard to account for if Jesus had been teaching his disciples frequently about this, you know? So my own argument is that the claim that Jesus is raised from the dead individually by himself, kind of before the general resurrection, is a kind of new thing that early Christians will claim based on their experiences. So I don't want to turn this into a conversation about the empty tomb, but you could argue that it's because they believe they found the tomb empty, and then they believe that they saw Jesus raised again, that they're kind of modifying, right, what they think is going to happen in the future. They're kind of inferring, well, the general resurrection must have begun already. And so you get, I think Paul is not wholly discontinuous with the rest of the movement in his claim that Jesus is the first fruits of the general resurrection of the dead. He's still making sense of the resurrection of Jesus in light of the general resurrection. So one way, I think a metaphor I use in the book to capture kind of the essence of my argument on this is, I think that if we imagine the eschatological teaching of Jesus as a kind of chapter book, the final chapter for Jesus has to do with the general resurrection of the dead and the judgment and the coming or the arrival of the Son of Man, whatever exactly that would have meant. And I think for the early Christians, they basically have the same final chapter. The thing that is new after Easter is that the early Christians have decided to write more chapters before the end because they believe Jesus has been raised individually from the dead. So you see Paul in his letters having to explain, well, why hasn't the resurrection happened then in 1 Corinthians 15? So he goes into this exegesis of the Psalms to argue, well, he's currently putting all his enemies under his feet. All of that is like, the question there is like not what happens at the end, but what's happening right now. And I think that is significant, that is the more pressing question for early Christians than kind of what happens at the end. I think they're in basic agreement with Jesus on that question.
Yes. And you also, at the very end of your book, kind of tie all this together with Jewish eschatology. And you say that all of these beliefs that would have been held by the historical Jesus are very much consistent with Jewish eschatology. And again, that's a part of the subtitle of your book. And the phrase that you coin is process eschatology to characterize Jewish eschatology, meaning that the way in which God in Judaism is going to bring about the end of history, however you conceptualize that, it's not going to be one event that just happens. It's going to be a process. So maybe talk to us about how Jews conceptualize process eschatology and how Jesus fits into that framework.
Yeah, great. And if I could, I would just, before I dive into that, I would just say this all comes from the final chapter of the book, where I lay out two different scenarios for reconstructing Jesus. And I just want to name, I think so usually when historical Jesus scholars are making an argument about Jesus, they're really arguing for kind of one reconstruction. Jesus was like this or did this or said this kind of thing. And that's certainly important. And for certain topics, I would do the exact same thing. But for me, with this topic, given the sources as they are and some of the questions involved, I don't think it's possible for us to do that with complete confidence. So what I'm doing instead is I'm holding up two scenarios that both cannot be true, but either one, I'm trying to argue, is more probable than the alternative that Jesus said nothing about his return after death, and it all was invented by his followers after Easter. And so the one scenario I hold up that I don't really believe is true is to bring back this Galilean crisis idea. So it's the idea that Jesus maybe initially thought the kingdom was going to come in his lifetime right away, and then he was rejected and kind of changed his scenario and thought, well, I'm going to defer this into the future or something. I just don't think the sources allow us to make that argument with any kind of confidence. And I go instead for this process idea. But I just wanted to name that Galilean crisis idea might well be true. I think it's more probable, actually, than the alternative that this all comes from Easter. But the process stuff, which I do spend some time talking about, is exactly as you said, this idea that you find repeated in other sources that when God really acts decisively in the future, however that's conceptualized in different sources, it's not necessarily an instantaneous change. We do find some sources that say that, but in many others, it's like a series of events. And I'm not talking about at least like eons and eons and centuries here, right? But I think there is a sense of like kind of sequence of things, right? That there's a beginning and an end of things that is not all happening at once. And so just a couple examples of places where, and these are intentionally drawn from kind of different movements that probably have very different eschatologies, but we see a kind of shared thing. So during the Jewish war with Rome, we know that the folks that had taken over the Temple Mount started minting new coins. And they started dating these coins as like year 1 of the redemption of Zion, all the way through year 4, we found these coins. So that is really significant because in some ways it's obviously a challenge to like Rome and their dating of things according to the imperial like reign, right? But it suggests that they think something decisive is happening, right? And they're marking time according to this, a process of time, even though we might say there's still a lot that still needs to happen, right? I mean, they are hemmed in Jerusalem and things are not all perfect at this time, but they're kind of dating this new beginning now, and they're seeing a process being started, right? I think that in Psalms of Solomon 17, a famous passage about the coming of the Son of David, there's a lot of different images a lot of them are inspired from Scripture and describing what this figure is going to do. But a lot of it, if you read it carefully, it has to assume like a period of time in which, the Jerusalem is being purged and the tribes are being resettled in the land and people are growing in righteousness and so on, right? So it's like a period of time that's being inaugurated, not like the Messiah shows up and boom, everything is perfect, right? And I think there's even some places in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a particular fragment I've worked on myself a little bit. It's an Aramaic fragment, 4Q246, that mentions a Son of God figure that I think is a messianic figure. And I think, interestingly, in this little fragment, we can infer that the Son of God figure shows up like before things really turn positive for the people of God. So there's a sense in which there must be, even though we can't fill in all the details, there's like some kind of inauguration and movement to this kind of more golden era. It doesn't just happen all at once. And so I think that makes good sense of a lot of the stuff in the Jesus tradition. Sometimes historians have taken like sayings of Jesus and broken them into like present kingdom sayings and future kingdom sayings and kind of pitted them against each other, which I think is really not the best way to go, because you have the idea, the present kingdom sayings make sense as claiming things are starting, this process is being initiated, without ever, saying like something like, the kingdom has come near. When I cast out demons, the kingdom is among you, or whatever. That doesn't mean like the end of history is here necessarily. It's just claiming something is starting, right? And so you can hold together the kind of present and future teachings of Jesus if you assume more that a process has been initiated, right? And we can make more sense, I think, of more data in that way.
That's perfect, man. We covered a lot of ground over the last 50 minutes or so, and I have two final questions for you about historical Jesus research. The first has to do with the impact that you want your work to have on the field. So you've published this book. How do you want this to change the course of historical Jesus research, or what impact do you want it to have on subsequent historical Jesus research?
Yeah. I mean, I think like most people, I hope that my reconstruction of Jesus is found compelling. That would be the ideal if that's the case. But if that's not the case, I hope that at the very least I'm reopening a question that shockingly has not been really of interest to Jesus scholars for a long time, and I hope I make the case that this really should be of interest, because you can't really make the claims about eschatology and the early Jesus movement without addressing this question head on. And so I could be wrong in my reconstruction, certainly, but the question then comes like, what's the better reconstruction? Right. And so if these sources mistake Jesus in more fundamental ways than I have thought, certainly possible. How did these sources then arise? Where did this stuff come from? It's kind of incumbent on all of us, I think, to offer arguments about Christian origins where we make the most sense of the most data, and not just kind of decide, well, we're going to explain this, but we're not really interested in explaining how the rest of that thing happened. So I hope that it opens up that question afresh in a really compelling way. And then also, and maybe even more importantly, I hope that it impacts the reception history of Jesus research, the reception history of the Bible, and specifically the question of how Christians have caricatured Jewish messianism. I think if there is any kind of theological significance to this project, I'm not writing as a theologian. I don't even know really what to do theologically with some of the historical conclusions that I reach. But I do think for someone who teaches at a seminary, I really want future pastors, for Christians in the present, not just pastors, for everyone, to be more sensitive to the way and aware of the ways in which Judaism has been made a foil, a caricature, to make Jesus stand out as better. And that's not good history. And it's also not good theology.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I really do believe that this book is going to have exactly the impact you were hoping. The last question I want to ask you is kind of stepping back and looking at historical research more generally. I graduated college in 2012, and I think that there was a sense at that point that there had been a lull in historical Jesus research. And we talked about this, I think, a little bit before the show here, that historical Jesus research, it's been broken up into those three different categories of the quest, the new quest, and the third quest. And the third quest ended sometime in the early 2000s. And there's been a lot of work done on the oral tradition and things like that in historical Jesus research, but there's not been one direction in which historical Jesus research has been headed. And a New Testament scholar named James Crossley, I've talked about him on the show a lot. I like a lot of his work. Mm-hmm. He's been proposing a fourth quest for the historical Jesus that he's calling the next quest. And I think they had a conference about this 2 years ago. I actually covered it on my show a little bit back then. Mm-hmm. But I'm very interested in the idea that New Testament scholars would try to push questions that hadn't been addressed before. And there's a book coming up soon on Eerdmans. They're sending me an advanced copy of it, and I'm really excited to read it, that you're contributing to, called The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, which I think is essentially an attempt to kind of outline what a fourth phase, so to speak, of historical Jesus research would look like. Since you're a contributor, I wanted to ask you about that. So where do you see the direction of Jesus research going? Do you think that the next quest is going to mark a sea change in New Testament scholarship? And I guess in general, like, where do you see the field in 20, 30 years from now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. So I'm very interested in this as well. And I would first say that I have a very similar perception, like you mentioned, in the early 2010s or whatever. It seems like kind of where is all the historical Jesus stuff? I remember, when I was younger, the SBL, like if there was a historical Jesus panel on anything, it would just be packed. And there was so much interest about this. And so explaining kind of what happened is itself a very interesting thing in reception history. And I personally, on a side note, I think a lot of it has to do with some fatigue a little bit, perhaps, about some very important questions about method, but I think they were a little bit tiring for people after a while. And it kind of took away attention from actually people doing historical work. They're talking about method all the time. And there's also been some developments in gospel studies, which has changed things.
Yeah, but I will say real quick to your point there, like, I think I took my first Gospels class it would have been either late 2008 or early 2009. And we learned about the third quest as a historical event. Like, it was something that was already done in 2009, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And so I'm excited. I mean, the next quest project, I mean, I'm really a lot of great scholars. I'm really excited to kind of be a part of that. The conference that we had was really amazing and really generative to hear these things. Part of, what I find interesting about this is I think it would actually be really, and I don't know how James would describe this or Chris Keith, but I think it's actually hard to really encapsulate all of the contributions in that volume as all kind of going in the same direction. And I personally see that as one of the positive things about this. And one of the great things about their leadership of the project is they're trying to raise new questions and create room for new questions in Jesus research. I would say, if I was to say what those are, they really tend to be around like materiality and the significance of social location in reading Jesus material, and also reception history. So opening up, like, not just did Jesus do or say this, but like, how has Jesus been understood? That should be part of Jesus research too. Really, really important. So I think there's contributions doing that. And then there's also some contributions that are kind of more traditional historical Jesus scholarship. And I think significantly they have that also in this volume. So they see this as also part of the future of the quest. I think they're seeing it as the next stage is opening up kind of new avenues of research, hopefully without losing some of the wisdom that we have before. And so, no, it is exciting. I think it's a little unknown right now as to what exactly is going to come next in terms of interest. I would say that I think there is, and I know an editor at Eerdmans who is kind of jokes about this, that Jesus is making a comeback. Jesus is coming back. And because there are, even this year, in the coming few years, there's several big projects on the historical Jesus that are about to hit the press. And so it's kind of an exciting time to be writing about the historical Jesus. Hopefully we can keep up the momentum.
Well, Dr. Tucker Ferda, it's been really great talking with you today. The book is Jesus and His Promised Second Coming, Jewish Eschatology and Christian Origins. It's out now on Eerdmans. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Before I let you go today, just tell my audience where they can find you, find your work, and support you and all that stuff.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not on social media, which I probably should rethink that.
Stay away as long as you can.
But I have a faculty page at Pittsburgh Seminary, so pts.edu. It has some lists of some things that I have written, and I also have an academia page where I have links to some articles or links to books and things, and I can also be contacted very easily there in messaging and stuff. And I'd be happy. It'd be fun to chat more about the things that I'm interested in with this book.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Ferda, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.